This morning we're going to begin a series of Bible classes on the book of 1 Samuel. And this is really just kind of a follow-up to our last quarter study on Judges. And really, I think we just kind of need to remember the big picture. This morning will be more of an introductory lesson. Our English Bible divides... Well, when you read the English Bible, your Old Testament is broken up basically into four parts. You've got the law, you've got the history, and you've got the poetry, and you've got the prophets. And sometimes we break the prophets up into the major prophets and the minor prophets. But that's really just a designation that's based on size. The Hebrew Bible arranged itself a little differently. They put their books into three groups. They had the law, which consisted of the first 5 books of Moses, of course. Then they had the prophets, which they included their history books in the prophets, namely the books of Joshua, Judges, and Samuel, and Kings, as well as Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and a book they called the 12, which was all 12 minor prophets in one book. And then they also had the writings, which basically consisted of everything else. Well, I think it's important to realize this designation. When the ancient Hebrews read their Old Testament, they believed that when they were reading a book like Joshua or Judges or Samuel or Kings, they were reading something that was written by the prophets. A prophet was not just a person who foretold the future, but rather a prophet was also a forth-teller. He was somebody who spoke forth the words of God. And not only was his business concerned with the future, he was also concerned with interpreting Israel's past, interpreting their history. And so what we are looking at effectively is a prophetic history. We're reading we're reading history, but not just any kind of history. Like you might open a history textbook today and there's this excessive concern with being very objective and factual and impartial, most of the time anyway. But in ancient history, it was more of what we might call a theological history. It's interpreted through the eyes of God. It's not just, well, we want to tell you what happened. We want to tell you the meaning of what happened. We want to tell you what God thought about these events. Now, the book of Samuel, and I'm calling it the book of Samuel because originally 1st and 2nd Samuel were one book. They wound up being broken up into 2 books later on. And this may have largely just been because size concerns. We couldn't fit all of it on the scroll, so we broke it up into 2 scrolls. But effectively, the book of Samuel tells us one story. 1st and 2nd Samuel should be read together and viewed together because they are telling a single story. And in fact, really, they are ultimately a part of an even larger story of the Bible. As we looked at last Thursday night, I did kind of a very... one man told me afterwards that it was the fastest overview of the Old Testament he has ever seen in his life. So I guess we went pretty quickly through it. But the idea, of course, is to show that the Bible is ultimately one story. Now, when we talk about an introduction to a book of the Bible, we usually ask questions like who wrote it, who was it written to, things like that. Who wrote the book of Samuel? Huh?
Does God know? It says
What did you say? It was not known? Yes, Jen?
Probably not Samuel.
Probably not Samuel. Why do you say Samuel didn't write it?
Because he dies in 1 Samuel.
Because he dies in chapter 25 of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel 25 and verse 1, yes. It's kind of hard to write books when you're dead. I mean, I'm sure there's probably some elaborate theory that he wrote it all out by prophetic dictation beforehand. And certainly God could do that if He really wanted to. I'm not going to question that. But I doubt very much that that's really what happened because the Bible never tells us that's what happened. The Bible doesn't tell us who the author is. Jen?
Maybe when Saul called Samuel, he wrote it then.
Maybe, you mean when Samuel called Saul, he could have written that down. There's actually a statement in the book of Chronicles that I thought was interesting. In 1 Chronicles chapter 29, in 1 Chronicles chapter 29, in the last 2 verses, in verses 29 and 30, it says, "Now the acts of King David, from first to last, are written in the Chronicles of Samuel the seer, in the Chronicles of Nathan the prophet, and in the Chronicles of Gad the seer, with all his reign, his power, and the circumstances which came on him, on Israel, and on all the kingdoms of the lands." Now, Well, remember, 1st and 2nd Samuel are one account of the life of David. 1st Chronicles is another account of the life of David. It's a parallel account. And we're going to be primarily focused on Samuel during this class. In fact, there isn't much in 1 Samuel that parallels 1 Chronicles, but at some point, if we need to consult Chronicles to give us further information, we will do that. Chronicles is, of course, worthy of its own study, but that will be saved for another time and another place. Or maybe the same place. We'll see. What we see here, of course, is that there were, before the book of Chronicles was ever written, there was something that Samuel did write some stuff about King David, and Nathan wrote some stuff about King David, and Gad wrote some stuff about King David. And it's possible, although there's no way to prove this, it's possible that we're really just looking at the combined work of these three guys when we're reading 1st and 2nd Samuel. Which would indicate that it was written by prophets. But, whether they wrote separately and someone else compiled them together, or whether they're just sources used by Samuel, I don't know. I don't think sources undermine inspiration, because Luke claims he used sources in Luke chapter 1. But clearly what we see is that we don't know for certain who wrote the book. We simply know that it ultimately is the product of God. So in that sense, we do know who wrote it. We know that it comes from God. Now, the Bible, as far as who it's written to or when it's written, we don't know a lot of that information too. If you don't know who wrote it, it's kind of hard to pin down when it was written as well. Ultimately, we have it preserved for us at this point. What was going on when the book of Samuel opens? Let's talk about some of the events that take place in the book of Samuel. What's going on at the start of the book, as far as Israel's history goes?
There was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes.
Okay, right. Yeah, that's the end. Yes, Jen?
They were fighting the Philistines.
They were fighting the Philistines. Okay, there's kind of a couple things going on here. First of all, they've got this conflict with the Philistines going on in the land of Canaan. And we know that there's kind of a lack of order in Israel. The end of Judges says that in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Judges 21 verse 25. Now, what we see is that there's really kind of a widespread lack of morality. We looked at the end of Judges last week, and you got Micah building idols, and those idols get stolen and brought to Dan, and Dan sets up a shrine to these idols and uses one of Moses' descendants as a priest. And the text of Judges says that shrine persisted until the days of the captivity of the land. Effectively, it never goes away until Dan is completely removed by the Assyrians. So that's a lack of morality. You can also read in Judges 19 and 20 and 21 the incident at Gibeah and the warfare that took place with the Benjamites. The nation has been involved in several civil wars at this point, especially during the time of Jephthah and the fiasco at Gibeah. The Israelite tribes were jealous of each other and suspicious of each other. And it actually becomes more problematic in the monarchy because during the time of David, did the tribes get along then? Yes? No? Maybe? Did the tribes of Israel get along very well during the time of David? No. Well, no, they don't. And you can see it especially in 2 Samuel when there's this fiasco going on with Absalom. And after David defeats Absalom and he comes back in, then there's this big argument between Judah and the rest of Israel about, we like the king better than you. Well, we like the king better than you. And, it's kind of like this dad likes me better thing going on. Eventually what happens is Sheba leads the northern tribes in a revolt against King David and has to be put down. And even during the time of Solomon in 1 Kings, we see that Solomon exacts tributes out of the other tribes, but not out of Judah. He exacts forced labor out of the other tribes, but not necessarily out of Judah. And these all sow the seeds for the division that takes place in 1 Kings chapter 12, when the kingdom divides in response to a number of factors. But there's So you've got you've got a unity problem in Israel. You also have a morality problem in Israel. You also have a military problem in Israel. Because the Philistines, they're at war with the Philistines at this point. Most of the nations at the time of... When the book of Samuel opens, most of the nations in that part of the world were kind of transitioning from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, and they're changing the way they use metal and whatnot. But, how well was Israel doing in this fight against the Philistines? Did they have an advantage? Were they winning? Were they dominating?
They had an advantage, but they didn't use it.
They had an advantage, but they didn't use it.
They didn't
Okay.
use it.
Yeah, were they dominating the dojo? No. What was wrong?
They weren't trusting in God.
Okay, they weren't trusting God. There's also a practical military advantage the Philistines had. In 1 Samuel chapter 14, early in Saul's reign, it's mentioned in verse 19. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. 1 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 19. No blacksmith could be found in all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So all Israel went down to the Philistines, each to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, and his hoe. The charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares, the mattocks, the forks, and the axes, and to fix the hoes. So it came about on the day of the battle that neither sword nor spear was found in the hands of any of the people who were with Saul and Jonathan, but they were found with Saul and his son Jonathan. And the garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass of Michmash. Now, the idea that's being conveyed there is that the Philistines have all of the military weapons and they have all of the blacksmiths at their disposal, but Israel doesn't. And I mean, we can't even sharpen our garden tools without taking them to the Philistines and paying for their blacksmiths to do it for us. So Israel is at a decisive military disadvantage at this point in their history. But yes, the real problem is how they got there. How they got there was they didn't trust the Lord. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And the problem, of course, is not the lack of a human king. The problem is a lack of recognition of Yahweh as king. The true king who was supposed to be ruling over them. Deuteronomy chapter 12 says that you shall not do what we are each doing here today, each one doing what is right in his own eyes. But yet that was precisely what Israel was doing. They were doing what was right in their own eyes. And now, effectively, what the book of Samuel is about in relation to all of these problems, the book of Samuel is about how Israel got a king. The establishment of Israel's monarchy. And that has repercussions for something else later on. I hope I illustrated that a little bit Thursday night. But ultimately, the king that Israel sets up is kind of foreshadowing a true king that God will send to redeem not just Israel, but all humanity. Jesus. The book of Samuel breaks into 4 parts, and I'll just kind of give a rough outline here. We'll go 1 Samuel 1 through 7 is about Samuel. It's primarily about Samuel, the last judge, the prophet of the Lord, who tries to help Israel through this time. And then 1 Samuel 8, I can't keep numbers straight in my head. 1 Samuel chapter 8, really through 15, is more about Saul, Israel's first king. And Saul has some good successes at first, right? He triumphs over the Ammonites. He leads the nation in battle. He even kind of has a noble, upstanding approach. He doesn't want to execute the people that initially oppose him as king. That, of course, unravels very quickly with Saul. As we see Saul's refusal to wait on the Lord, Saul's making of false vows, and Saul's failure to destroy the Amalekites and obey the Lord. And as Samuel tells him when he's departing, to obey is better than to sacrifice. Saul, you can offer as many sacrifices as you want, but if you're disobedient to the Lord, you might as well be practicing divination, he says. In 1 Samuel 16, I need a different marker. Should stop using the green. In 1 Samuel 16, and really kind of all the way through 2 Samuel 4, we have a conflict between Saul and another king, a shepherd boy that has been anointed by Samuel, David. And this conflict between David and Saul is a direct result of, Saul's actions, which, the Lord rejects him as king. Samuel tells him that the Lord has sought out another man after his own heart. He has sought out a man, he has taken the kingdom away from you and giving it to your neighbor who is better than you. And the bulk of this is this conflict between David and Saul, starting with David's anointing, the battle between David and Goliath, which is really more about, why isn't Saul killing the giant? Because it's his job. Well, David comes in and does it for him. And from there, the people begin to recognize David as a military hero, one who has surpassed even the exploits of Saul. Well, that makes Saul very jealous. Saul wants to kill David now and put an end to this before David takes the throne away from him. But through a series of rather shaming circumstances for Saul. David is twice put in the position where he can actually kill Saul, and he doesn't do it. And he reveals it to him and says, Saul, you've been hunting me in the mountains. I'm not your enemy. Everyone else is, well, you seem to think I'm your enemy. I'm not. I haven't harmed you once. And Saul's descent into madness is one of those interesting things in the Bible where somebody they become so paranoid about everyone around them that they begin to treat people like they're their enemies when they're not really. There's probably a lot of Sauls in our world today. We need to be very careful about not becoming Saul, not allowing the devil to take his hold on us the way he took his hold on Saul. But eventually Saul dies, and I include 2 Samuel 1 through 4 up here because the beginning of 2 Samuel is basically about, David taking the kingdom of Israel as a whole. He's anointed king over Judah, but it's not enough. He must be king over all Israel. And so there's a conflict in the first 4 chapters of 2 Samuel between the house of David and the household of Saul, led by Ishbosheth, the man of shame, we might say, as his name is translated. And eventually Ishbosheth dies, and David is appointed king over all Israel because he's the king's son-in-law, because of all of Saul's other sons are all dead. That leaves David pretty much as the only legitimate heir to the throne at that point. And so 2 Samuel 5 through 24 is really about the Saul reign of David. So this is the story told in 4 parts. Samuel, Saul, the conflict between Saul and David, and finally David himself alone. And let's talk a little bit about these two guys. What would you say about Saul and David? What makes them... Well, let me ask this. How are they alike? Do they have anything in common?
At some point they were popular, I guess.
Okay, at some point they were popular among the people. Good. What else?
Neither one of them looked upon themselves as kingly material before they were selected.
That's true. They both had rather humble beginnings. Don?
They're both warriors.
Okay, they both turned out to be warriors. Good. What else?
Both were initially anointed.
They were both conditionally anointed?
Oh, no, they were both anointed.
Oh, they were anointed. Yes, they're both referred to as the Lord's anointed. And here's the thing. Late in Saul's reign, when it's clear that the Lord has rejected him in every way, David refuses to kill him. Why? What's the reason he gives?
Because he says he's not going to kill God's anointed.
Because he says, I'm not going to stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed. The Lord's anointed is a big deal. It's a big deal to David, who has been anointed by the Lord, but it's also a big deal when he's thinking about other people who've been anointed by the Lord, like Saul. In fact, there's a psalm that David wrote that warns about the dangers of conspiring against the Lord's anointed. In the 2nd Psalm, David asks, why are the nations in an uproar, and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and rulers take counsel against the Lord and against His anointed, saying, let us tear their fetters apart and cast their cords away from us. But what does God think of that? Well, he who sits in the heavens laughs, verse 4. The Lord scoffs at them. He will speak to them in His anger and terrify them in His fury, saying, as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. And the psalm goes on to warn about the dangers that befall those who would dare conspire against the Lord anointed, the destruction that must surely await them. Mark.
I contrast that with Jeroboam, the first of Israel, when God told him during Solomon's reign that He was going to make him king. Jeroboam immediately sets about to try to usurp Solomon's rule and become king. And so he lifts up his hands against God's anointed, whereas David would not.
All right. Yeah, there's definitely there are. Yeah, we might talk about that some more when we get to Kings, but that's an interesting observation. David's loyalty to Saul, by the way, who's tried to kill him numerous times, David's loyalty to Saul is such that when somebody comes to David and claims, I've defeated the king for you, I've killed Saul for you, how does David react to that?
Not favorably.
Not favorably. What does he do?
Kills the man.
He kills the man. And I think the man that told him that was lying. But David says, your words have testified out of your own mouth that you killed the Lord's anointed, so you will be executed. There's an instance, by the way, where the law of Moses said that you needed 2 or 3 witnesses to execute capital punishment. in Deuteronomy 17 and 19. But that, of course, is circumvented if the guy actually confesses to the crime. Then you don't need any witnesses because by his own mouth he is judged. Jen?
They both get rebuked by a prophet that says, I anointed you, why'd you do this?
Yes. They both have a scene that's rather pivotal to the story in which they are confronted by a prophet of the Lord. Saul's is in 1 Samuel chapter 15, where Samuel confronts him. He says, you haven't done what the Lord told you. You haven't killed all of the Amalekites. You haven't defeated them the way I told you to. You've spared their king. You've spared their livestock. You've done it all wrong. And Saul says, no. I fulfilled the commandment of the Lord. I did what was told to me. I did exactly what you told me. And after several rounds of protesting between the two of them, Samuel says, the Lord has rejected you as king. You won't listen to him. You won't obey him. And Saul goes, oh, no, I'm sorry. I've sinned. Samuel's leaving him. He grabs his robe. The robe tears in his hand. Samuel goes, the Lord has torn the kingdom from your hand. It's a confrontation with a prophet that goes badly. But David has a very similar scene. In 2 Samuel chapter 12, David commits adultery with a woman living near his palace, Bathsheba, who happens to be the wife of one of his trusted mighty men, Uriah the Hittite. He takes her for himself, and lo and behold, they found out after the fact she's gotten pregnant by this little tryst that has taken place. So what happens? Well, first of all, we've got to get Uriah to think the child is his, so he tries to send Uriah home, get him drunk a couple times to get him near his wife. That doesn't work. He says, well, we're going to have Uriah killed. And so he arranges for Uriah to be killed on the battlefield. And David kind of congratulates himself, a little bit, because, only he and Joab and a couple others knew about it. But God knew about it, and he was displeased. So he sends Nathan the prophet to him. And Nathan the prophet confronts David and says, you have acted wickedly. You are the man who's behaved in such fashion so as to basically take something away from your neighbor for yourself, even though the Lord's provided you with all these great things. But David's reaction on that occasion is very different from Saul's. He doesn't protest. He doesn't try to argue his case. He doesn't make excuses. He simply admits, I have sinned. The words he uses are the same. Saul said the same thing to Samuel. But the difference is the motivation behind it. David confesses, I have sinned, upon realizing the error of his ways. Saul confesses, I have sinned, only when it realizes that not confessing is going to cost him something. Now all of a sudden, we got to move things around. It's acting purely from selfish motives. The reason David is a man after God's own heart, it's not because of, he's such a perfect, righteous, holy person. David broke 5 of the 10 commandments. He does a lot of stuff that's just totally wrong. The reason David is a man after God's own heart is because of his own heart. Because he ultimately does not see the need to make excuses for himself. He is penitent. You read some of the Psalms he wrote, you can see that. I think that's the real crucial difference between David and Saul is how they deal with their sins. They have a lot in common. Both of their ranks begin with a series of triumphs. Both of their ranks the descriptions end with a series of their spiritual failures. Here's something else for you to think about. Both David and Saul had to deal with kind of a rivalry king movement during their reign. Saul, of course, has to deal with David during his reign, and you can see a lot about his character by how he deals with David. What about David? Did David ever have to deal with something like that? What did David have to do?
It was his son who was his wife.
Okay.
If I remember correctly.
Yeah. Well, in 2 Samuel, really pretty much everything from 2 Samuel 13 and 19 is about how Absalom kind of stages his coup against David. And why is the Absalom story in the Bible of all things? About all the details about David's reign the narrator could have shared with us, he devotes so much space in 2 Samuel telling us about Absalom and his bad relationship with his father. But it's really to be apparent, there is almost kind of an invited parallel between Saul and David, if you will. We're kind of supposed to think about that connection there for a second. Okay, Saul did not handle David very well. How's David going to handle Absalom? Well, what we see is that Saul finds out David's been kind of, getting assistance from the priests. What's Saul's response to that? Kill all the priests. Yeah. And then he acts surprised later when he inquires of the Lord and the Lord doesn't want to answer him anymore. What about David? What's David's attitude toward the priest during the time of Absalom?
He sent him back to Jerusalem, right?
He says, no, go back to Jerusalem. I don't expect you to help me. If the Lord is on my side, He'll bring me back to the ark of God. But I don't, David does not force the priests to help him. They volunteer their aid. But David is more concerned with the will of the Lord than about structuring his politics in that particular instance. So we see that David has to deal with, Saul has to deal with the people's affection shifting to David. David has to deal with the people's affection shifting to Absalom. But there's a stark contrast between how they handle the priests on that occasion. And there's a stark contrast with how David is viewing that whole thing. Saul is constantly trying to kill David, and David doesn't want to kill Saul. He wants to keep his hands off him. The relationship is backwards with David and Absalom. Absalom's plan is to send out men to overcome his father David and destroy him. David finds out Absalom's been killed. What's his reaction? He gets upset. He's angry. He wants to put Joab has to kind of say, David, you've got this wrong. Why do you love those who hate you and disrespect those who just saved your life? What's wrong with you? So there is that little contrast going on as well. David's attitude and Saul's attitude towards their insurgents is very different in turn. And so we begin to see kind of how David is much different from Saul in turn. They're placed in a lot of the same situations, but David deals with them much differently than Saul does. That's why David is the man after God's own heart. That's why the Lord chooses David, Saul is chosen as king. He's a big guy, head and shoulders above everybody else. David is small. Why choose the little guy as king? Why choose the little guy to fight the battles? We like to picture David as this great warrior. David wasn't a big guy. He wasn't this big mighty man on the battlefield. He was the scrawny shepherd boy. And yet he becomes the great warrior. Why?
Well, I told Gideon, you got too many people, pare them down. And then again, you still got too many people. Pare them down, 300, and then go after the host of Midian. Mm-hmm. So that you will know that it is God who fights and wins your battles for you and not by the strength of your own might.
Yes. Yeah. Did you have something?
That's basically just to demonstrate the power of God.
Yeah. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, whenever Samuel goes to Bethlehem, and he consults Jesse. He's been sent there by the Lord. And he sees... And here's the thing, Samuel's the one that anointed Saul. Samuel goes to Jesse's house to anoint one of his sons by the Lord's instruction. And he sees the firstborn son. And what's Samuel's reaction? This must be the guy, right? Surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. 1 Samuel 16 and verse 7. That's so crucially important. And this parade of sons goes by him, and they're all rejected by God. Not because of some external characteristic, not because they look bad or because they're not tall enough. You must be this tall to ride the kingship ride or something like that. No, they're rejected because of something in the heart. David goes out to the battle against the giant, and David says, "Why aren't you guys going out there and killing? Whoever goes out and fights this giant who's blaspheming the Lord, he'll win, because the Lord's not going to allow a blasphemer to stand." And David's brothers are the ones going, hush, hush, hush now. There's a big difference in the attitude between Eliab and the other brothers and between David, who is the man after God's own heart. Saul should have been the one to fight the giant. He's practically a giant himself. But he doesn't do it. Instead, when he finds out David he tries to bribe people into doing it first. Then he finds out, David's going to be David's volunteering. Here, I'll give him my big super armor, which doesn't even fit David. David defeats the giant with rocks, basically. He's resorting to Stone Age methods there. And, that's the real turning point right there, when the nation begins to see that Saul's not the king we need. David's the king we need.
David didn't go out to fight Goliath because of the reward that Saul had offered to David. He went out to fight Goliath because he was appalled that here was this Philistine dishonoring God Almighty.
Yes.
He wasn't going to stand for that.
Yes, that's a good point to bring up. Some other things to think about in Samuel. The book of Samuel has a lot to say about kingship in general, and it's clearly one of the most important things in Samuel. There's the promise to David, of course, in 2 Samuel 7, which I'm fond of referencing because it's one of the key passages, not just to understanding Samuel, but to understanding the whole Bible. And seeing how Jesus fulfills that. But more generally, we might note a couple of other things. The book of 1 and 2 Samuel begins and ends with a song. There's the Song of Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 2. And the last line of the last verse of 1 Samuel 2, verse 10, those who contend with the Lord will be shattered. Against them he will thunder in the heavens. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth, and he will give strength to his king, and will exalt the horn of his anointed. Now Hannah says that before there's ever a king in Israel. The Lord is going to give strength to his king and exalt his anointed. But Hannah says this before a king ever happens in Israel. She's anticipating a king. In 2 Samuel chapter 22, there's a big song at the end of the book, another piece of poetry. And in 2 Samuel chapter 22, in verse 51, this song ends by saying that He, Yahweh, is a tower of deliverance to His king and shows loving kindness to His anointed, to David and his descendants forever. So you can see how that line is very similar to the last line in Hannah's song. 1 Samuel 2:10, 2 Samuel 22:51. They both end with references to God strengthening and saving His king and His anointed one. Well, 1 Samuel 2 merely anticipates a king. 2 Samuel 22 comes out and says, we have the king that the Lord has strengthened, and he is David and his descendants forever. So there's ultimately looking forward to a king beyond David. Now, did David's monarchy last forever? No, Israel, it was obliterated when Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiachin into captivity and then came back and deposed his uncle Zedekiah. And, to this day, no king on the face of the earth rules on the throne of David. And yet, we do have Jesus, the King of Kings, who ultimately rules and reigns from heaven. And He is the one that these passages ultimately anticipate. Contrary to popular belief, God did intend for Israel to have a king. Sometimes you'll hear people teach 1 Samuel 8 like, God never wanted Israel to have a king. That wasn't the problem. The problem in 1 Samuel 8, when the people say, give us a king, the problem isn't the fact that they asked for a king. The problem is entirely their reason for asking for that king. Why did they ask for a king in 1 Samuel 8? To be like the nations around us. We want to be like everybody else. We want somebody to fight our battles for us. Well, those aren't legitimate reasons. You already have Yahweh to fight your battles for you. And you've been called to be a holy nation separate and apart from the rest of the peoples to be mine. What do you want a king for? Oh, but the Lord definitely anticipates a king when He makes promises to Israel. Genesis 49 talks about how the scepter will not depart from Judah. Genesis 49:10. Balaam, in his prophecy in Numbers 24, talked about how he saw a star coming out of Jacob, a ruler who would rule over the people. And there is a provision for kings found in the law in Deuteronomy 17, one that suspiciously looks like 1 Samuel 8 in terms of what's going on. And God gave the people instructions. Don't appoint a foreigner over yourselves. Only appoint a king that God chooses. Don't multiply horses. Don't let your king multiply horses or wives or gold. Things that Solomon later does in violation of Deuteronomy 17. It's a policy of stark contrast, though, between the military and the political and the economic strategies of every other king in the ancient Near Eastern world. It's of interest to note, the fact that God chose a king over Israel ultimately needs to be understood in the context of the fact that God Himself is called king in Deuteronomy 33, verse 5. The problem, though, is that the people demand a king in 1 Samuel 8. It's not the fact they requested a king. It's not like they got their Bibles open and said, oh, well, Lord, we saw you promised a king. We'd like that king now. Well, that would have been a little more legitimate, I guess, anachronistically, that is to say that they probably had their Bibles in little codex forms like we do. But no, that isn't why they asked for a king. They asked for a king because we want to be like everybody else. The Lord had a plan to give Israel a king that was not like everybody else. A king that was so different from the policies of the ancient Near Eastern world around them. A king that stood in stark contrast with all that the world said make good leadership. And Saul was chosen. Saul's the picture-perfect image of the kind of king that Israel wanted. He was the king they wanted, but not necessarily the king they needed. What do we see there? We see that Saul has great military prowess, his resources, let's take the livestock of the Amalekites and use it for sacrifices. It sounds pious on the surface. Expelling the mediums from the land sounds pious on the surface. But when you break it down, Saul's lacking the thing that most needed in a king. The heart that is devoted to the Lord. Because that is the real criteria for leadership. The heart that is devoted to and focused on God and loves the Lord. And that's why David is brought into the picture. David, who the nations around them would not have chosen as king, but who winds up being the king of Israel, in the sense that all future kings are compared to him and measured by him. Every king in the books of Kings and Chronicles, the comparison's always made. Well, he did good, just like his father David before him. He did not do good, just like his father David before him. He did not walk in the ways of his father David. He did walk in the ways of his father David. David became the standard by which all other kings are measured. Saul's hardly mentioned at all after you see the stuff in Samuel that takes place. He might be mentioned a couple times in the prophets here and there, and for the most part, Saul's kind of forgotten about in their history. He's kind of the tragic failure. David is the one who becomes the king in the true sense that the people are looking for. Not the king that they chose, but the king that God chose. They saw the king as a means to be like the nations and win their battles. God indicates their true sin was rejecting him from being king over them. In Judges it said that there was no king in Israel and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Well, the people asking for a king, they're still doing what's right in their own eyes. And in the time of the kings, Israel continues to do what is right in their own eyes. And when the time finally comes when God sends them their true king, Jesus, people continue to do what is right in their own eyes, don't they? They do not accept him as their king. They want him as king in the geopolitical sense, the way they wanted the king in 1 Samuel 8. They were going to make him king by force in John chapter 6. But when it comes down to it, and the accusations are made, and they bring him to trial to Pilate, and Pilate brings him out before them, flogged, beaten, made a mockery of. This is the king that God has chosen for them. A king who will ultimately be shamed and crucified. Is that the kind of king Israel wants? As Pilate says, "Shall I crucify your king?" Well, Israel says, "We have no king but Caesar. We would rather do what is right in our own eyes even now." They reject God from being king once again in John chapter 19. But lo and behold, their verdict does not stand. The Lord's verdict is the one that stands. Men may have judged Christ to be unworthy by putting him to death, but the Lord vindicates him by raising him from the dead, exalting him to his right hand, making him King of kings and Lord of lords. And behold, he is alive forevermore. The question we have to ask ourselves is, are we going to choose the Lord as our king, or are we going to choose the kings of this world? Are we going to be king in our own lives, or are we going to allow the Lord to be king in our lives? Those are some things to think about. There's probably a lot more comments we could make. I haven't even talked about the theme of prophecy in Samuel. But I think we're going to close here. Does anybody have any comments or questions? Just observations they want to make? No? All right. Well, I would encourage you to read 1 Samuel as much as possible during the course of the study. I also have some question handouts. We're going to try this again and hopefully see how it goes. What I have is I have them written on the front and the back. 1 Samuel 1, 1 Samuel 2. That'll cover Thursday and next Sunday, respectively, is what I'm hoping. But anyhow, take these and fill them out, and hopefully come prepared to discuss some of these questions next time. Thank you. Saul tries to spear Jonathan and David. David is upset that some of his spears asked him to death 3 times. With 3 spears. Question? Yes, I am making assumptions. If you don't know how to read, that's okay.
Both of us go down.
I don't know about this is a handout for the class.
Hey, I think I need one.
Oh, that's right. That's right. You and Jenna have switched. There you go. I don't know if I can get work on it.
Well, we can share.
You can share. Okay.
Oh, well, you're like, that's not my favorite.